After losing his job in 2001, he spent 2 years homeless on the streets of Miami and 10 months in a New York City shelter. Since 2007, Rob has been a homeless and housing activist working with organizations across the US and around the world. And then we have Gretchen Purser. Gretchen is an assistant professor of sociology at Syracuse University at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. She's also chair of the board of the Workers Center of Central New York. She is the author of the forthcoming book, Labor on Demand, Dispatching the Urban Poor from the University of California Press, and articles published in ethnography, qualitative sociology, critical sociology, and more. Her scholarship focuses on work, labor, and urban poverty in the United States. Then we're joined by Craig Wilsey. Craig is an associate professor of cultural studies at George Mason University. He is the author of The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States from the University of Minnesota Press. He is also co-editor of special issues of The Scholar and Feminist Online and Women in Performance, as well as Beyond Biopolitics, which is a collection of essays on the governance of life and death. And finally, we are joined by Nikita Price, who is the civil rights organizer at Picture the Homeless. In this campaign, he focuses on selective police enforcement and broken windows policing as it applies to the homeless and poor in New York City. Nikita joined Picture the Homeless in 2006 and has been with them as the civil rights organizer since 2014. He is presently raising 2 lovely daughters, Nanina and Naima, as a single father, and is passionate in his role of fatherhood and social justice organizing. Picture the Homeless presently has a major voice in one of New York's largest coalitions, Communities United for Police Reform, and sits on the Policy Working Group and Steering Committee. And finally, asking the questions and moderating this conversation, we have our very own Teresa Gowan. She teaches ethnography and urban sociology at the University of Minnesota. Since publishing her ethnography, Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders, Homeless in San Francisco, also from the University of Minnesota Press, she has developed her ongoing interest in neoliberal poverty policy into a comparative qualitative study of addiction treatment, focusing particularly on the uneasy convergence of punishment and the therapeutic court-mandated or strong-arm rehab. So please welcome our 5 plenary panelists.
That's how it goes. You're in Minnesota. So look, let's start with Rob. What we've done is try to figure out questions which will bring out like the diversity of strengths that these folks, are bringing to our conference, and that we know is sort of proliferated around the rest of you. Is this thing still clicking weirdly? Okay. Okay. So with Rob, we know how much you've worked extensively across using human rights within academia, NGOs, and local grassroots organizing. So you've got like this really very broad, multi-level kind of set of connections, and we wanted you to kind of just say something briefly about, how do you see this relationship between scholars and activists playing out in some of the stuff that you do?
So, thank you. And before I respond, I want to first thank the University of Minnesota. This is my second time here in about 6 months. I got to meet Teresa. Eric I've known for a number of years. When he was thinking about grad school, he sought me out, and I tried to steer him towards the City University of New York Graduate Center, which is a favorite institution of mine, but he ended up out here in Minnesota, but we still stayed in touch with one another. So I just want to thank Eric for bringing us out here, and I know the hard work that goes into putting something like this together. So props to you, brother, and your education out here. And I want to also say thank you to Teresa, who, on my first trip out here, gave me a wonderful book that I'm reading for the second time. Teresa wrote an incredible book called Hobos, Hustlers, and Backsliders. And it's a book that gives us an inside look at street homelessness. You heard from the introduction that I'm formerly homeless, so I know what that life is like. I have that lived experience. It is a wonderful dialogue of stories, or a gathering of stories of people living on the streets of San Francisco that I think is a must read for anybody who's experienced homelessness or thought about homelessness in any deep way. It's a dynamite book. And as I said, I'm reading it for the second time, so thank you. I think the question you raised is an interesting one to me. I'm a former member of Picture the Homeless. After I came out of homelessness, I joined the organization that you've heard a lot about already since you've been here. And I think it started for me in the shelter. When I arrived in the New York City shelter, I was starting to hear this phrase called gentrification. And I didn't know what it was, but I knew this phenomenon was taking hold in New York City at the time. And for me, I also saw a struggle of people in the shelter system trying to get housing. And it seemed to me, and it wasn't just a theory, it was happening this way, that it was people with a mental health diagnosis were the people that were being housed, and people that were considered general population, like myself, no diagnosis, you know, for whatever reason, we just had a hard time, right? We couldn't find housing. There was no affordable housing in New York City. And forget it, I was blessed to have an education and had a formal work history, but a lot of people that are stuck in that shelter system in New York didn't have that. So I would use my time in the shelter to go to the library and learn about gentrification, and I started to understand these challenges. And I was talking to the executive director from Picture the Homeless earlier today as we were talking, and I said, do you remember a conference that we were at Columbia University? It was the first time I'd ever talked publicly about these issues. I'd never done it before. Lynn and I were there representing Picture the Homeless, and on that panel, immediately to the right of me was Dr. Peter Marcuse, a professor emeritus from Columbia University. To his right was Brenda Stokely, a well-known municipal union worker and activist in New York City, one of the founders of the Million Workers March movement. And to her right was Ed Ott, and then he was the director of the Central Labor Council in New York, right? So these are powerful folks that were sitting up there with. I was sweating bullets, man. I'm telling you, I swear to God, I was sweating bullets at this particular time. But I did my talk and got a lot of applause, but there was somebody in the audience, I made a statement, and I made this phrase. I said, gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And there was another distinguished professor sitting in the audience by the name of Neil Smith, and he stood up and said, say that again? Neil Smith was a geographer from New York City and at the CUNY Grad Center, and he said, say that again, and I made that statement again. Gentrification leads to displacement, which leads to homelessness, which leads to criminalization. And Neil said, I want to talk to you after this conference. And that was the beginning of a change in my life, or what I call transformation. I had never sought out academia. I was raised in middle-class surroundings, working-class family. I didn't do a lot of reading once I got out of school, but Neil forced that issue. Neil said to me something that resonated with me for the rest of my life. He said, my students can learn as much from you and people like you, Rob, who have lived experiences, as much as they can from somebody like me who has a document that officiates me somehow. So I want you to come up to the university and talk to my students. You talk to my class and share your experiences. But at the same time, I'm going to challenge you to take my students out into the community so they can touch and feel those experiences that you were sharing in this particular time. So it was the beginning of a relationship, and Neil had me read at a particular time when I wasn't interested in reading. He had me read some of his own books, and I'll give you two in particular that I wrote down here because it was a time when I wasn't thinking about reading. So one was Uneven Development, because I started to learn about gentrification, and the other one was Gentrification of the City. But he also shared a little story with me. He said, one of my mentors is also teaching at this university, Rob, and I want you to go meet Dr. David Harvey, right? But before you meet him, I want you to read two of his books. I know I'm giving you a lot of assignments, but I want you to just come back and when you read them at your pace, and when you're ready to talk about them, you read them. That was Rebel Cities, and then he said, A Companion to Marx's Capital. Because one of the things that flipped me out, one of the things I kept saying is, I said, land and housing just doesn't work. Poor people can't afford these market prices. We got to pull it off the market. And Neil just kept smiling at me. He said, read that book, and then you come back and you talk to me about that book. So for not going on and on and on, I'll just say it was the beginning of a relationship, but it was a relationship that there was shared learning, and as Neil called it, learning is reciprocal, right? The community comes into the academy goes out into the community, and that cycle continues, and it needs to be replicated or continue those particular relationships. Fast forward a couple of years later, after these relationships are developing with people like Peter Marcuse and others, and we do an action with Picture the Homeless in New York City. We took over a building on 116th Street and Madison Avenue in East Harlem, and it was the first time anybody had ever taken over any property in New York City in a number of years. And professors started popping up at this action. One of them was Mark Nason, who was a professor of African American Studies at Fordham University, and he said, this is really interesting what you all are doing. I want you to read this book. They were doing stuff like this in the 30s. I want you to read this book. And I'm like, shit, these guys keep giving me these books to read, right? And they want to talk about it. But it was interesting. Some of the things that we were doing he was comparing to history, which I didn't know this history. So it was an opportunity to interact with academia. And it realizes, like, you could have ideas about how we got to where we are, how you make social change. I like to call myself a practitioner of direct action and civil disobedience. But Neil would always say to me as I walked through the halls of the Graduate Center, Rob, you and Max at Take Back the Land always talk about nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. I want you to know the revolution can be violent. Just think about it. He'd just keep on walking, right? He'd plant these seeds and making you think and constantly opening up. But what it did is brought me back to him to say, okay, what do you think about these tactics that we're using to reclaim property? Does it make sense? And these dialogues opened up, and you saw these interactions. I'll suffice to say that there are other professors in this room that I've been in conferences with that are thinking about it, and I do believe there is such thing as scholar activists, right? There is a group called the NOSA, the International Network of Scholar Activists. I work with people like Manisha Desai and Jackie Smith, and these are folks that are working with grassroots organizations and helping to develop these ideas and theories that folks are coming